Picture this. Tony Soprano opens a door and sees Arty, his oldest friend, the one person left who isn't a soldier, a leech, or a liability. For a split second, Tony is genuinely happy. Actual warmth. Then Arty raises a gun. And here's the part most people miss. Tony doesn't explode. He doesn't threaten. He doesn't scramble. He just absorbs it. Like a man who already did the math and doesn't care about the answer anymore. Because in Tony's head, this isn't Arty having a moment. This is the final betrayal. The one friendship that wasn't supposed to be for sale, sold. And if the person pulling the trigger is his only true friend, Tony's reaction isn't fear, it's resignation. Watch his face. He's not thinking, how do I survive? He's thinking, so this is how it ends. And when Tony realizes Arty isn't a hitman, just a broken civilian trying to feel powerful for once, it doesn't make the scene safer. It makes it sadder. Because even then, Tony still lies, still manages, still keeps the truth buried, while looking weirdly relieved that the bullet never comes. So the question is simple. Why does Tony look like a man who's ready to die before Arty even pulls the trigger? The moment Arty raises a gun at Tony Soprano is routinely filed under shocking, as though the scene's only job is to provide a jolt and then shuffle everyone back to the comfort of pasta and denial. That reading misses the point with impressive confidence. The tragedy is not that a civilian dared to aim a weapon at the local monarch of violence. The tragedy is how quickly Tony seems prepared to accept it, as if being killed by his oldest friend would merely be the final administrative step in a life already emptied out. Tony's first reaction is almost disarming. Genuine happiness at seeing Arty, the rare, unguarded warmth reserved for someone who is not a subordinate, a creditor, a rival, or a walking liability. Then the barrel appears, and the warmth drains away into something colder than fear. In that instant, Tony doesn't just register danger, he misreads the motive, assumes Arty has been paid to execute him, and lands on a conclusion that is as bleak as it is revealing. Fine. If the person holding the gun is the only true friend left, then maybe the whole thing can finally be over. There is no heroic defiance, no calculating counter-threat, not even the usual performative outrage. There is, instead, a man who briefly looks like he has misplaced the will to continue. It is difficult to romanticize that kind of surrender, even in a show that treats moral collapse like a long-running lifestyle brand. When Tony realizes Arty is not a hired assassin, but a wounded friend lashing out, the situation does not become healthier. It merely becomes more intimate in its dysfunction. Arty, in his own chaotic way, understands that Tony's intentions were not purely malicious, but the method was spectacularly stupid. The kind of help that detonates a restaurant and expects gratitude as a side dish. And because this is their relationship, the scene manages to be grim and darkly funny at the same time. Arty explains his plan aloud, and Tony's face practically announces with reluctant clarity that no, this was not thought through, not by either of them. The comedy does not soften the cruelty, it underlines it. Even here, with a gun in play and a friendship in freefall, Tony still defaults to what he does best, lying. Not a strategic lie meant to survive an external threat, but the habitual lie of a man who cannot bear to be fully seen by anyone who might actually matter. The most unsettling detail is how calm Tony remains. He is not calm because the situation is safe. He is calm because the relationship is. Arty is, effectively, protected property. If almost anyone else pointed a gun at Tony Soprano, there would be a body, and the episode would spend the remaining minutes on cleanup logistics. Others have pulled weapons in Tony's orbit and survived only through very specific circumstances, mitigating context, witness control, internal politics, a well-timed intervention by someone whose name carries weight. Arty survives because Arty is Arty. He is the one civilian who can breach the perimeter, insult the king, and still be told, almost gently, to take it easy. This is not tenderness so much as a warped privilege. Arty's safety is less about innocence than about Tony's need to keep one human relationship uncorrupted enough to serve as proof, however flimsy, that he is not entirely a monster. Naturally, that proof comes with a long-running unpaid tab. In this world, affection often looks like exploitation with better lighting. The matter of perception hangs over the gun scene like a silent jury. Violence in Tony's world is not merely about what happens. It is about who sees it, who hears about it, and how the story can be weaponized. The fact that no one else witnesses Arty with the gun is not a minor detail. It is the difference between a personal crisis and an organizational scandal. If another mobster had seen a civilian holding Tony at gunpoint, the calculus changes, because reputation is the only currency more sacred than money. Even if Tony could not bring himself to destroy his oldest friend, the pressure to restore the illusion of invulnerability would be immediate. These people do not simply live by violence, they live by the performance of it. And yet, in the privacy of that confrontation, Tony behaves like a man who is almost relieved that the threat comes from the only place it can still hurt. That is why the scene plays as sad rather than merely suspenseful. It reveals a Tony who, for a moment, seems to believe there is no purpose left beyond enduring humiliation until someone ends it. The episode around it matters, of course. What other wars are raging? What betrayals are fermenting? What family crisis is consuming him? But the emotional truth is clear without a timeline. The idea that Arty would kill him for petty cash hits Tony not as an outrage, but as a confirmation. In a life built on transactional loyalty, the one bond that was supposed to be exempt has finally been priced. The show never needed to say it aloud. Tony's face says it for him. Meanwhile, Arty's volatility is not a surprise to Tony. It is practically a character trait Tony has filed under manageable. Their history makes the outburst legible. Arty grew up near the gravitational pull of the same crowd, close enough to feel included when they were teenagers, then left behind when the others graduated into crime, status, and fear-based admiration. Every time a gangster walks into Arty's restaurant, the room tilts. The criminals become important, and Arty, the man who owns the place, becomes the catering staff in his own life. The gun, then, is less a genuine attempt at murder than an exaggerated protest, a desperate, melodramatic declaration that he is not to be treated as a disposable civilian. It is the physical manifestation of wounded pride, a tantrum dressed as a threat. Tony knows this. Tony also knows how to keep treating him like one anyway, because Tony is a specialist in condescension disguised as affection. That is why the interaction stings. Arty's gesture is meant to force respect, and Tony's response, calm, paternal, evasive, grants concern without granting equality. The scene also carries the shadow of Tony's mother's machinations, because the show delights in layering betrayals until they feel hereditary. One reading sees additional bitterness. Tony recognizes with sickening clarity that a parent could manipulate his closest friend into turning a weapon on him. Whether or not that specific realization dominates the moment, the mother's influence stains it. Arty's performance across those episodes, first facing Livia and then Tony, lands with brutal precision. The visible deflation when Arty is told not to blame Tony, the confusion, the hurt pride, the sudden recognition that he is a pawn in a game he pretends to understand. This is where the show's acting flex becomes more than craft. It becomes anatomy. The question that follows, and that never quite goes away, is why Tony forgives Arty so easily. On principle, pointing a rifle at a made man should be a death sentence, at least in a mythologized criminal code that pretends consistency is real. But Tony's world has never been run on principle. It is run on appetite, guilt, and self-image. The simplest answer is also the ugliest. Tony knows he was wrong. He may never admit it cleanly, but guilt leaks through in every indulgence. The restaurant fire, whether openly confessed or silently understood, creates a debt that cannot be paid in cash. Forgiveness here is not mercy, it is damage control. Tony needs Arty intact because Arty is the one relationship that predates the mafia persona. Friends since Moses wore short pants, as the sentiment goes, which is just a colorful way of saying the bond is ancient enough to serve as identity scaffolding. Tony can lose soldiers, associates, even relatives to resentment and suspicion, but losing Arty would be losing the last witness to a version of himself that existed before the throne. That is why Tony keeps eating there, keeps returning, keeps letting insults slide that would get anyone else maimed. It is also why Ralph, for all his bravado and cruelty, understands that touching Arty would mean Tony breathing on his neck. Arty is insulated not because he is strong, but because Tony has claimed him as proof of humanity. The irony is that this proof includes a running tab and the occasional weaponized favor, endless Berjol and Bucatini as emotional insurance. The relationship is frequently described as loving, and there is love in it, but it is love filtered through the mind of a narcissist who cannot resist converting intimacy into ownership. That narcissism becomes clearer in the later pattern. Tony wants to care about Arty, but he also wants to use Arty as an alibi. If he can point to a childhood friend outside the life, someone he protects, someone he helps, someone who still speaks to him without trembling, then surely he cannot be as monstrous as everyone insists. It is a convenient narrative, especially for a man married to self-justification. Yet, the facts remain inconvenient. Nobody who truly cares for someone burns down their livelihood, lies about it, and then treats the victim's restaurant like a private pantry. The bar for good friend in this universe is so low it is practically subterranean. Being a decent companion is reduced to not systematically destroying the person's business the way another civilian, Davy Scatino, is destroyed. And that comparison is essential because it exposes the cruel mechanics behind Tony's selective kindness. If Arty had owned a sporting goods store instead of an Italian restaurant, the story strongly suggests he would have been processed like Davy, bled dry, busted out, discarded into despair. Food, in Tony's world, is not just pleasure. It is leverage, nostalgia, ritual, and self-soothing. An endless supply of comfort on credit is not an incidental benefit. It is a reason. Tony's restraint with Arty is often portrayed as evidence of a soul. It may also be evidence of a palate. The Jean Phippe scam sharpens the same dynamic into a cleaner moral test. Arty, seduced by a fantasy of sophistication and status, sinks money into a dubious liquor venture, an investment plan held together by a French accent, a vaguely glamorous bottle, and the presence of an attractive hostess who brokers the introduction and flatters his ego. It is almost comically transparent, which is why the question arises: did Tony know Arty was being played from the start? One argument holds that Tony, who can see several steps ahead when it suits him, likely recognized the scam's shape, even if he did not have every detail. Another insists the show gives a moment of genuine discovery, a scene in which the liquor is dismissed by someone who has actually tasted the real thing abroad, and Tony's expression registers surprise as the penny drops. That surprise can be read as proof he did not consciously know at first, only suspected it in the vague, intuitive way predators sense weakness. Either way, the more revealing question is not what Tony knew, but what he chose to do with what he could reasonably infer. Charmaine, grounded and unsentimental, sees the con immediately and treats Arty's midlife swagger with the skepticism it deserves. Ralph refuses to lend money, not necessarily because he knows the vodka's origin story, but because he understands the practical problem. Collecting from Arty would be impossible without inviting Tony's wrath. Tony, by contrast, says yes. That yes can be read as benevolence. It can also be read as vanity, the desire to be the magnanimous friend after Ralph plays the villain, to perform kindness while keeping the option of future leverage. Tony is opportunistic by habit. He does things he later regrets, often because he prioritizes emotional gratification in the moment, being seen as generous, being needed, being superior, over clear moral action, such as warning Arty before he humiliates himself. The refusal to give a simple, protective truth fits the pattern. A man who truly wants to spare his friend would say, plainly, "This is a bad idea." Tony instead allows the situation to ripen into disaster, and then positions himself to be the rescuer, the enforcer, the one who can fix it when the civilian world chews Arty up. Whether this was deliberate strategy from the outset, or merely an unconscious drift toward the familiar role of savior-tyrant, hardly matters. The outcome is the same. Arty is embarrassed, financially wounded, and forced to accept the kind of help that humiliates as much as it aids. The show repeatedly demonstrates that Tony can predict the collapse of a compulsive gambler like Davy with near certainty. Debt and appetite make outcomes predictable. With Arty, prediction is murkier, but the pattern of Tony's behavior remains consistent. He rarely prevents suffering when he can instead manage it and extract something from the management. Even the idea that Tony intended well does not absolve him, because intending well in Tony's vocabulary frequently means wanting to feel like the good guy without behaving like one. If Arty's gun scene reveals Tony's numbness, the destruction of the gun reveals Arty's. The claim that Arty likely knew Tony was behind the original restaurant fire is difficult to dismiss. His rage is too specific, his devastation too intimate, yet he does not pull the trigger. Some want to attribute this restraint to loyalty, to decades of friendship, to a refusal to harm the only person who has remained close. Others point out a more basic truth. Arty is not a homicidal sociopath. He is a normal person, flawed, needy, envious, but still tethered to a moral reality Tony abandoned long ago. Even with motive, he cannot cross that line. There is also fear in the background. Fear of what would happen if he killed Tony. Fear of retaliation. Fear of the machinery of violence that would grind him and his family into dust. But fear alone does not explain the act that follows. Arty smashing the rifle against his own car, an explosion of frustration turned inward. It is as if the only target he can safely damage is himself. Read symbolically, it is a kind of self-castration, the destruction of the phallic weapon, the abandonment of the fantasy that he can ever confront Tony on equal terms. Whether intended or not, the gesture lands as capitulation. After that moment, Arty rarely stands up to Tony with the same force again. He circles the impulse, approaches it, but backs away into tears, resignation, and self-harm ideation. When the Jean Phippe deal collapses and money vanishes, the despair curdles into something close to suicidal. The restaurant fire, the scam, the humiliations, all of it resurfaces in later seasons, bubbling up when Arty and Charmaine cater Livia's tribute, and again when Arty tangles with Benny Fazio, and the resulting fallout drags Tony back into the mess. Even a seemingly unrelated remark, Arty blaming the element allowed into his restaurant for credit card fraud, echoes the arson paranoia and the constant sense that his livelihood is forever vulnerable to the criminal ecosystem he cannot stop feeding. The Arty-Davy comparison exposes the show's bleak hierarchy of usefulness. Both are school connections, both invoke shared history, but only one is permitted to repay debt slowly, one meal at a time, while staying largely intact. Davy, once he enters the executive game and tries to play gangster without the stomach for it, is put on the standard program, stripped, busted out, ruined. The reason is not merely that an Italian restaurant is more useful than a sporting goods store, though utility certainly matters. It is also about the nature of the relationship. Arty and Tony maintained an actual friendship into adulthood, however corrupted. Arty does not habitually try to weaponize nostalgia as a bargaining chip. Davy does, and Tony visibly despises it. Remember when is not a sentimental bridge for Tony. It is an irritation, a reminder of vulnerability, a demand for softness he resents being asked to display. Davy's approach, jokes, deflection, casual familiarity, the assumption of leniency because their kids share a school orbit, reads to Tony as disrespect. Worse, Davy lies. He omits existing debts, sneaks deeper into the hole, even falsely implies authorization for additional credit while Tony is asleep. Tony may like Davy, may even respect the old version of him, But once the degenerate gambler is revealed, respect collapses. And in Tony's world, respect is the closest thing to mercy. Arty, for all his envy and theatrics, is more upfront about what he wants and why, even when those wants are embarrassing. He takes Tony seriously, which paradoxically earns him more patience. The show also suggests a social chronology. Arty is the friend from the earliest years, embedded in the identity narrative, while Davy arrives later, a high school connection rather than a foundational one. That distinction matters to a man who collects symbols of himself the way others collect souvenirs. Add to that Arty's civilian status. Civilians are sometimes treated, in Tony's private logic, as distracted children, dreamers who do not fully understand the consequences of challenging him. That attitude can produce a bizarre leniency, the way a tyrant might pat an artist on the head for signing the wrong petition. Not because the tyrant is kind, but because the artist is dismissed as harmless and politically incoherent. It is condescension masquerading as forgiveness. In early seasons, when Tony is still capable of a more indulgent version of himself, hospital fundraisers, suburban respectability theater, the high watermark of his ability to pretend, this leniency appears more often. As the series darkens, Tony's vindictiveness and caution sharpen, and the fact that Arty still survives his transgressions becomes even more striking. Arty is, essentially, grandfathered into safety. He can insult Tony, privately of course, in ways no associate could. He can demand Tony pay his tab, mock him for throwing money at entertainers while refusing to settle debts, challenge his entitlement to run a restaurant merely because he eats in one, even insult the food choices. Others, faced with similar disrespect, settle for petty rebellion, urinating in a pool, swallowing rage, accepting the death of a twin as the cost of doing business, because they have no real leverage. Arty has leverage precisely because Tony needs him. That need is what makes the relationship almost heartwarming, if one's standards for warmth include emotional hostage-taking and unpaid brajol. Arty's significance to the series is therefore not a mystery. He receives substantial screen time because he is not merely a restaurant owner who feeds criminals. He is Tony's last functioning link to the civilian world. The one relationship that offers a glimpse of Tony as simply Tony, not as a boss surrounded by men who want him dead or want something from him. Silvio may be loyal, may be a friend in the sense of shared history, but that friendship is knotted into the organization. Silvio does not cross Tony personally because he is not allowed to. The rules of their world make intimacy conditional. Arty, being outside, can throw food, shout, point weapons, and survive, which is precisely why the relationship feels real amid a landscape of transactional alliances. That reality, however, is not pure. Arty also functions as a cautionary portrait of envy. Here is a man with a successful restaurant, a capable wife, children in good schools, and a respectable life. Yet he still covets the hedonism and swagger of the criminal lifestyle. He wants to be noticed the way gangsters are noticed. He wants to feel powerful, desired, significant. The Jean Phippe fiasco, the flirtations, the mood swings, the dramatic gestures are all symptoms of the same hunger. Not to be a civilian nobody while important men sit at his tables. The tragedy is that he is not built for that world, and every attempt to touch it leaves him humiliated or harmed. The comedy is that he keeps trying anyway, as though the universe has not already delivered a full syllabus on how this ends. The deterioration of Tony and Arty's relationship also tracks Tony's spiritual decay. As the series moves forward, Tony alienates nearly everyone, leaving himself ringed by fear, resentment, and the brittle remnants of loyalty. By the end, even the childhood friend who once served as his moral mirror is damaged, exhausted, and diminished. The question of why Tony does not kill Arty after the rifle incident then has an answer that is both simple and damning. Tony legitimately loves him. In the limited way Tony can love anyone. Arty is the brother he never had. the companion from before the life, possibly the only person who is close without needing status, money, or protection as the entry fee. Uncle Junior may occupy a complicated corner of that emotional map, and a few others briefly qualify under the umbrella of familial projection, but Arty is unique. He is loved not for usefulness alone, but for what he represents. Tony also knows Arty is unlikely to pull the trigger. He knows the anger is justified, knows the confrontation is personal rather than business, and knows that a drunken civilian with wounded pride is not the same threat as a rival with a plan. That knowledge does not make the situation safe. It makes it tragic. It means Tony can absorb a gun being pointed at him and respond with weary concern rather than survival panic. Because the deepest wound is not the weapon. It is the realization that this is what their friendship has become. Those who want to argue Tony is not a full psychopath will find their evidence here. Empathy flickers for ducks, for children, for Arty, and occasionally for a friend he will still kill if the logic of his world demands it. That last clause is the point. Empathy exists, but it is fenced in, rationed, and frequently overridden by appetite and self-preservation. Arty survives because he is inside the fence. Davy does not because he stepped into the game and tried to cash in on nostalgia like it was a valid currency. Others do not because they are not permitted to be real with Tony without paying in blood. In the end, the Arty gun scene is not merely a memorable burst of tension. It is a distilled thesis statement. Tony Soprano's life is a system that poisons everything it touches, including the one friendship that once promised an escape. Arty is the civilian anchor that keeps Tony from floating entirely into monstrosity, and Tony repays that anchoring with lies, exploitation, and help that arrives like a controlled burn. The miracle is not that Arty points a gun. The miracle is that he puts it down, shatters it, and walks away, choosing, however painfully, to remain a normal person in a story that relentlessly rewards the opposite. Subscribe if you want more analyses of the people who get hurt simply by staying close.